Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this briefing on the humanitarian emergency in Gaza. I'm Eric Schwartz, President of Refugees International, and we are pleased to be joining with the Century Foundation in co-hosting this event. We are very fortunate that two of our guests this morning are Palestinians living in Gaza and individuals with significant responsibility and roles relating to humanitarian and human rights issues. We want our audience, and most of you are based in the United States, to hear firsthand accounts of what Palestinians in Gaza have experienced and have witnessed not only over the past 2 weeks, but for years. With respect to the latest round of violence, a much needed ceasefire was reached on Friday, but the toll of 11 days of fighting has been tragic. More than 240 Palestinians, including 66 children, have been killed. 12 Israelis, including 2 Israeli children, have also been killed. Thousands of homes and businesses were destroyed in Gaza, and water and power infrastructure were severely damaged. There will be long-lasting scars on people inside of Gaza. Most have witnessed the tragic loss or injury of someone they know, a family member, a friend, a neighbor, or a colleague. Most have also been affected by the widespread destruction. On the Israeli side, too, civilians were traumatized by more than 4,000 rockets fired indiscriminately by Hamas, though reportedly some 90% of the rockets were blocked by Israel's missile defense system. In Gaza, humanitarians and development experts will, thankfully, do what they do after such devastation. They will seek to provide critical relief and also seek to begin a process of recovery, rehabilitation, reconstruction. As this goes forward, and as Refugees International urged in a September report on Gaza, the Israeli government must lift unreasonable restrictions on critical supplies and on movement of aid providers. And we urge US officials to strongly press the Israeli government on this key issue. Tragically, any reconstruction efforts in Gaza will confront an already devastated economy and society with a poverty rate that has grown to over 80% in recent years, a healthcare system that had already been devastated by the blockade, by lack of funding, and by shortages, all made worse by COVID-19. But even as we at Refugees International support the ceasefire and the provision of humanitarian relief, we must also recognize issues of human rights and international humanitarian law that reflect a broader context, both for understanding and for advocacy, a broader context that does not deny the right of Israel or any government to defend its citizens from indiscriminate attacks, but a broader context that also recognizes that the assertion of that right cannot be the end of the inquiry. There is the issue that sparked much of the recent violence, the threatened forced evictions of Palestinian families in East Jerusalem, and the critical questions raised about equal rights and equal justice for Palestinians. There are the ongoing violations of the law of occupation by the government of Israel due to expropriation of land in occupied territories and the creation of Israeli settlements. There are concerns surrounding civilian casualties and damage to civilian facilities that raise profound questions about proportionality of Israeli action under international humanitarian law. And perhaps most importantly, there is the concern about the apparent unwillingness of the current government of Israel to envision the kind of end to a decades-long occupation which would meet internationally recognized standards about equal rights. And there is the concern that this unwillingness will result in ongoing occupation of the territories in ways that violate international human rights and humanitarian law, in ways that effectively accept indefinite and dramatic restrictions on the basic rights of the Palestinian population in Gaza and beyond, and in ways that will result in further cycles of violence. These issues inevitably raise the question of the role of the international community in general and of the United States in particular. To be sure, the United States and other governments of the world cannot dictate policy to the government of Israel, or for that matter, to Hamas or the Palestinian Authority. But individuals and organizations committed to humanitarianism and human rights can and should press our own political leaders to oppose abusive measures and to ensure that foreign assistance is not used to support violations, such as settlement activity and disproportionate attacks on civilians in the context of conflict. Given the Biden administration's articulated commitments to human rights at home and around the world, we would hope that these kinds of perspectives would be received sympathetically within the administration. But we have panelists who are far better equipped than I to address these sets of issues. So let me turn the floor over to Thanasis Kambanis, co-director of the 20th Century Foundation's Foreign Policy Program. Thanasis, the floor is yours.
Thanks for that introduction, Eric, and it's an honor today to moderate this event with four deeply connected people who are very close to the conflict. I'm Thanasis Kambanis, and I'm going to go very quickly into the questions because you don't want to hear from me. We want to hear from Amjad Shawa, who's the director of the Palestinian Non-Governmental Organizations Network, which coordinates 150 Palestinian organizations in Gaza, Jerusalem, and the West Bank. We're also going to hear from Raji Sourani, who's the director of the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, Elizabeth Campbell, who's the director of UNRWA, which is the most important organization in terms of providing services and support for Palestinians, not only in the West Bank and Gaza, but in the diaspora. And finally, Tanya Hari, who's the director of Gisha, an Israeli not-for-profit, which focuses on issues of access to Gaza. Today, our panelists are going to talk in detail about the consequences of this latest conflict for Gaza, but also for Palestinians elsewhere. And they're going to talk about the causes and triggers of this conflict, which, as we know, did not begin in Gaza, but began with the expulsions in East Jerusalem. So without any further ado, I want to start with you, Amjad. Can you tell us a little bit about the conditions in Gaza today, 4 days after what you described before we began today as a very fragile ceasefire went into effect? And can you also talk about how the destruction from this 11-day war compares to the 50-day war in 2014?
Thank you, and it's my honor to be with you today, and thanks for Refugee International to host this meeting and to organize it. I will not recall the history, but Gaza is still occupied physically and legally by Israel, and they have the full obligations according to the international law that mentioned by Eric. And we have to emphasize that Israel is responsible completely about the situation in Gaza Strip and to alleviate the suffering of the people. Israel wants this occupation to be free of charge. And I will not disconnect the suffering, the last offensive on Gaza from what's happening in Jerusalem and the West Bank. It's Israel occupation. The same violations committed there, it's committed by different way in Gaza Strip. The target bank in Gaza during the 11 days, as it was in the different wars against Gaza, were the civilians and the civil premises. And the numbers mentioned by Eric, it's increasing day by day. We have 2,000 people who were injured and injured severely, most of them children and women. And every day we are losing lives. We are not numbers, we are lives, we are feelings. Our children also traumatized. We are talking about 2 million Palestinian children, women, elders, and others who are living in small piece of land called Gaza, which is an open air prison for the last 14 years. Catastrophic conditions due to this blockade, continuous tightened blockade, prevent entering the basic materials to Gaza, and what had been declared by the Israeli army minister yesterday was published widely that they will not let in any kind of materials to get in Gaza. Already the crossings with Gaza is closed. And today the human rights organization raised an issue. Bodies of Gaza patients who were treated as patients in Jerusalem or West Bank or Israeli hospitals who were died. The Israeli occupation prevent to get them back to Gaza. The bodies of people who died prevent entering the fuel. Food for the animals of Gaza prevent, now the crossings are closed. To tell you about the 11 days, it's not 11 days, it's 1 million seconds that we passed. I calculated them. It's 1 million seconds of the 11 days. Thousands of airstrikes in each corner in Gaza Strip. And after the war, we discovered the streets, we discovered the homes of the beloved ones. The rubble which were covered, the bodies of children and women in different areas in Gaza. The media offices which was targeted, the Associated Press, Al Jazeera and other 30 media offices. Israel prevented the international media to get in Gaza during the 11 days. It's a big question. Prevent the entering of the humanitarian coordinator, the honorary commissioner to get in Gaza, the other humanitarian workers to get in Gaza. The death was there and is still there, and the fragility of the situation is calling you that this Gaza case is not a humanitarian. The roots of the problem is political, it's a human rights, and we have to deal with this to stop the occupation, to end the occupation on Palestine, to respect the international law and the humanitarian law. Gaza people are calling for justice. Justice is not only for Palestinians, for anyone all over this earth.
Amjad, when we were preparing for this session a few days ago, you said that in 11 days, the destruction wrought was more than during 50 days of bombing and a land invasion in 2014. Can you just, in a couple of minutes, especially for our listeners here who might not have the same sense of Gaza and what the impact of these wars are on people, can you just give us a sense of what is the lived scope of destruction and also what it felt like to live under what must have been an incredibly intense attack if it was able to create so much damage in such a quicker span of time?
From the first second of the war, the target was clear. 20 people were killed, 10 of them children, 2 women, while they're preparing for Al-Eid, for our Fitr. After Ramadan, we have Al-Fitr Eid, which is festival for the Muslims. 20, and the children were preparing them to celebrate. This is the target. In one night, there was 150 jet fighters, according to the Israeli media, bombarding Gaza in the same time. It's midnight and became light. Every corner, bombardment. We didn't know where to go. The bombardments was everywhere, during the day, during the night. The destruction is huge. Towers, 4 towers in 3-4 days were destroyed. Hundreds of housing units were destroyed and offices. The factories in the Gaza industry zone, about 15 factories completely destroyed, where we have hundreds of workers and labor. The Gaza farms completely destroyed, and farmers were killed while they're trying to reach. The problem also, one of the things, that if you calculate the numbers, comparing to the 51 days, it's more. It was intensive. And they're using the airstrikes in each corner of the Gaza, and nothing prevent them, and nothing. The problem that there was the silence. Before we have the humanitarian, in 51 days, we have the humanitarian corridor for medical and the humanitarian aid to enter. Now they closed Gaza. Until now, they are closing Gaza. The big issue that from the 3 wars happened, and we have no accountability. And if this will will continue. Israel will not hesitate to do the same. Thank you.
Raji, Gaza was already under tremendous pressure before this war. Tell us in what ways you expect life to get worse for Gazans after this conflict, and please speak to the political dimensions of this as well as the humanitarian.
Well, these days coincide with the 54th anniversary of the occupation and 73 years of Nakba. The world never ever spoke about just or fair occupation. We're talking about a criminal, belligerent Israeli occupation, not according to our standards, but according to the standards of the International Criminal Court. Second, we are subject, as Amjad said, to criminal, illegal, inhuman siege for the last 14 years, no movement for goods or individuals. And that's already, made Gaza paralyzed, crippled. 65% unpaid or unemployed, 90% under poverty line. 85% receive rations from UNRWA. So we are like nation of beggars waiting for international community to dump some food and medicine. Big shame that this persecution witnessed by the whole world and nobody did anything in this regard. We, in 5 years, were subject to 3 wars by Israel, and many civilian targets suffered and paid dearly and heavily in 2008, 12, and 14. And this left Gaza destroyed and unable to rebuild itself. We have one of the highest percent of university graduates on earth. We have very skilled working class. We don't need donation from anybody on earth, but the Israeli army
I think maybe we lost Siraji's connection. So I'm going to turn to you, Elizabeth, and then hopefully Raji can reconnect and we can pick up where he left off. Elizabeth, can you, I know UNRWA has been the clearinghouse for taking the inventory of the awful toll of this conflict in tremendous and heartbreaking detail. Can you give us the overall picture of loss of life and the human impact of the conflict, but also of the infrastructure damage? And tell us a little bit about what it'll take to restore Gaza to its condition just before this latest conflict.
Sure. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me on the panel. It's a really important conversation. I think the very first point that I would make is that the civilian population, including the refugees for which we are responsible, is deeply traumatized. And this is a new trauma that is compounding with previous trauma. So when you speak to most families, including our staff, they talk about the long-lasting psychosocial impact. So everyone now is trying to quickly turn the conversation to rebuilding, but as my colleagues are quick to point out, it will be very difficult to rebuild from this particular episode, given just the traumatic experience, the witness to violence that many children had to endure, and the sheer terror and fear that they felt over the last several days. As you know, there's nowhere to run. They cannot escape the Gaza Strip. They cannot take safety in any type of underground protection or facility, and so they have to endure. And as my colleague had told us during the height of the airstrikes, families were having to make decisions about whether to sleep together, so they would be killed together, or to sleep apart with the hope that one person might survive. So this is the population that is coming out of this last episode of conflict and hostility. In sort of more specific terms, I think as folks may be aware, about 70,000 or so Gazans took shelter in our UNRWA-run schools, almost 60 schools altogether. It's the only place where many of the civilian population felt that they would be safest from airstrikes, understanding that it's very unlikely that all parties to the conflict would target UN facilities. So that's a population now that we're looking to serve and to address their most immediate humanitarian needs in the form of water, food, sanitation. Many of them, of course, have lost their homes, so they're not able to return, even though there is a ceasefire. So that's where our immediate needs are focused. And then the third place is really just trying to get our, what we call our sort of core services back up and running. And here, I mean, in particular, our healthcare, our primary healthcare system and our education system. The best that we can do to help refugees in Gaza today is to make sure that the kids are back in school to the extent possible. This is it's a way to create a certain normalcy in their life and to get them focused on something that is incredibly important to the people. Obviously, we're now just doing an assessment of the total damage. And I know that in addition to the $38 million for which we are currently appealing to the international community to meet immediate humanitarian needs, we will likely be joining the rest of the UN in longer term redevelopment projects, which of course, as you indicated, will include infrastructure. And for us in particular, the homes that have been destroyed, people will need to be able to find shelter in the long term. So I think in the coming days, we'll have a better sense of what those needs are. But obviously, I think the sense of sort of hopelessness and a feeling that, you know, refugees and the civilian population are unable to really protect their children from potential future episodes is what's really creating a sense of fear and trauma that we haven't seen before.
Well, and I'm curious, we've now been through in short order, and as Raji was outlining, so many cycles of this type of fighting and destruction. Does the work of UNRWA amount to, after each one of these conflicts, trying and failing to get back to the level of just before the most recent conflict, while trying and failing to manage the psychological and other toll that these conflicts take on people in Gaza? And are we seeing overall a sort of steady decline in the health and standard of living of this population that's weathered just an unbelievable number of disproportionate wars over less than 2 decades?
I think that's right. I mean, what my colleagues are saying and what our Commissioner General said over the weekend is that, you know, this last episode has taken Gaza back several years. You know, our staff, as you probably all know, are predominantly Palestinian refugees themselves. They come to work every day, having lost their own homes, their own family members, having had to witness, you know, the violence. And so they are traumatized. The medical care workers who have to, as one colleague put it, see repeatedly, you know, children who are coming in and provide this sort of, you know, traumatic care to them over and over and over again. Of course, it's very traumatic if you're a healthcare provider or a doctor or a nurse. And so it is increasingly impossible to work under these conditions, especially when Gazans are not provided an opportunity to recover, if you will. And here again, I'm especially mean on the mental health side. It's compounding trauma over time. It's taking an enormous toll on children. Of the 66 children that were killed, 19 of them went to our schools. This is very traumatic for the families, for the teachers, for the fellow students, and it is increasingly difficult to keep, you know, rebuilding. It's very cliche to say that Palestinians in Gaza are resilient. They're resilient because they have no choice, but to continue to endure these circumstances. So, you know, for UNRWA, it is very difficult. We're the largest, as you said, the largest civilian humanitarian provider there. For most people in Gaza, UNRWA is their source of employment, their livelihood, their source of food, their source of education, and their source of healthcare and medicine. So we are centrally vital to every aspect of life there. And of course, as my colleague said in Gaza, you know, it's you know, we look forward to the day when UNRWA doesn't need to be so central and so vital. And we I think it's important that we're able to provide food assistance to 1 million people, but that's not a number that we would like to see grow.
Thank you. Now, Tanya, you and your organization have focused for more than 15 years on access to Gaza. And I think people who don't follow Gaza closely are always stunned to realize that every single person who comes or goes, or as Amjad pointed out, every dead body, every bag of cement, every bag of food requires permission from Israel. So as you talk, it would be great if you can help clarify what these conditions are, because that literal description, I think, helps people understand what occupation means in the case of Gaza. Can you tell us what the state of access to Gaza is now at the end of this war, and who and what are being allowed in, and what are your top priorities at Gisha in terms of changes that you're pushing for right now?
Sure, thank you. And thanks also for hosting this conversation. I'm really glad to be here with, especially with my fellow panelists. Our organization was founded in 2005, just ahead of when Israel pulled its military installations and settlements from the territory. And the narrative within Israel especially, but also Israel's narrative to the outside world since then has been, we left Gaza, we no longer have responsibility for it, and now we're just victims of hostility from Gaza. And I would say that, one of my goals in speaking today and wherever I'm speaking is that we should dispel ourselves of these myths. One of the main ways that Israel maintains control over Gaza is through movement and access, and that's why we focus on this issue. But of course, movement and access is everything. It's life itself. It's healthcare. It's the economy. It's family life. It's water. It's electricity. So through its control over movement and access, it's literally controlling what aspects of the economy can function and which can't, which kind of crops are grown and where they can be exported and sold. Which members of family you might be able to visit, whose wedding you can attend. Israel does control still the sea, the airspace. It controls the electromagnetic space, radio frequencies. So it determines what kind of quality of internet service people have in their homes. I mean, really down to every single detail. And through its control over movement and access, but not just, also through its use of violence and other things, what we've seen over the years is an attempt to apply pressure on the civilian population to use its control over movement and access to make headway in kind of its political goals. And I would say that one of the important things that we see, and to connect to something that was alluded to by Amjad, was that the situation in Gaza cannot be divorced from what's happening in the West Bank and Jerusalem. Through its control, particularly over movement of people, Israel is able to control demographically the way that Palestinians exist in the space of this region between the river and the sea, where people can live, where they can have a family. And what we see consistently is an attempt to isolate Gaza, both from Israel and particularly from the West Bank. So that's a kind of very broad strokes picture in terms of what's happening today. So indeed, Erez crossing and Kerem Shalom crossing, the main pedestrian and commercial goods crossings connecting Gaza to Israel and to the West Bank, are virtually closed, and they have been for the past 2 weeks. So what we've seen today is just aid workers, foreign journalists being allowed into the strip. No movement, including for urgent humanitarian cases, even medical cases, people trying to seek life-saving treatment in hospitals, mainly in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. In terms of Kerem Shalom, the main commercial crossing of Gaza, closed except for allowing in some humanitarian aid. What we understood was that today about 35 to 40 truckloads of goods would be allowed in, compared to a daily average of about 400. So we're talking about 1/10 of the daily entrance of goods for a population of 2 million people after the crossing had been closed for 2 weeks. Completely unacceptable. Now, Gaza does have two crossings with Egypt. It has the Rafah crossing, which connects Gaza to the outside world, that is functioning. It's open for limited travelers, categories of people. And also there's a smaller crossing that is open for allowing some goods in. It's not an internationally recognized crossing. It's not used by the international community. It's a small crossing that provides goods basically run by the local government in Gaza. So it's not an alternative to Kerem Shalom. And what we're calling for immediately is for the crossings to be reopened. More broadly speaking, I think what we're calling for is an end to the collective punishment of residents of Gaza. There are 2 million civilians living in the Strip, the majority of whom are children and young people. It's unacceptable that they continue to pay the highest price for what's happening in the region.
Thank you. And we now have Raji back with us, and we'll turn back to you. You can continue where you left off, but I'd also love to hear from you about efforts to hold Israel accountable for war crimes, which is an effort you've been centrally involved with, and also your views on the United States government, which has continued even in a recent tweet by Secretary of State Blinken to oppose any kind of international criminal court investigation into Palestine. Please feel free to share your thoughts on any and all of those questions.
I just have heard the last words from our colleague in Gisha and talking about the crossings and the number of trucks, etc. This is the tragedy. I mean, this is the tragedy as the Israeli High Court of Justice, when we went and challenged this criminal, illegal, inhuman siege, the persecution of 2 million people of Gaza to the Israeli High Court of Justice, and they said, nobody should be worried about famine in Gaza. There will be no hunger. We will guarantee, we count every calorie, I mean, Gazan steak, and we will guarantee there will be no famine. This is the shame. This is the shame. You know that the occupation count how many calories, I mean, each Gazan takes. So what I was saying, 54 years of belligerent criminal occupation, 14 years of criminal blockade on Gaza, targeting 2.2 million people. With that, 3 devastating wars in the eye of the storm, when civilians and the civilian targets, not allowing me to rebuild Gaza again, not because we don't have resources, not because, international community then do that, but they said it clearly, literally, the Israeli political leaders, we are going to send you to the age stone. This is the Israeli message, I mean, to the Gaza. Now, with all that, we are having COVID-19, nothing unique in that. Ouagadougou had the COVID-19, Washington had the COVID-19, but we have the COVID-19 with entirely destroyed medical facilities and structure due to this criminal blockade in Gaza, due to this criminal siege. Now, on top of all this, while UNRWA since 2012 says Gaza inhabitable place, that's OCHA report, and that's the whole world what they know. And on top of all that, we have this criminal offenses again. In Beirut, 2006, they called it Al-Dahya doctrine. This time, they call it Rimal doctrine. That's the Israeli media, that's the Israeli official. That's Halutz, the head of the Israeli Air Force, talking about Rimal doctrine. Rimal doctrine means we are going to inflict terror and pain, awe and pain in the hearts and minds of 2.2 million people of the Gaza Strip. They want to get Hamas. What's the problem? They want to get Fatah. We have no problem. We are, as a human rights organizations, are there to protect the civilians at the time of war. International law, international humanitarian law, it's not for intellectuals, it's not for academics. It's for the people to live it on their skin and to feel it. It's the people to be protected at the time of war, and this is happening. Now, even with this war, the target of the Israeli bank of targets, it's shameful. I'm wondering how this mighty army with the most high-tech airplanes, with the most high-tech rockets, targeting civilians. Abu al-Auf family is the enemy of Israel. The children of Abu al-Auf family are the enemies of Israel. The Kolak family is the enemy of Israel. Shuruq Tower is the enemy of Israel. What is this immoral army and nation? How they can accept this? It's big shame. These things for tanks, for terrorists, for this and that. And we are seeing, and the whole world seeing, what was the targets. Towers, COVID-19 laboratory, desalination plant, factory. They are targeting streets with the sewage system, with the water system, with the electricity. That's the Israeli mighty army, I mean, and their mission in Gaza. And they want us to be good victims. They want us to be giving up. And nobody will give up, and nobody will be a good victim. The whole world saying, even this shameful Europe, shameful US, Israel in self-defense, we are victimizing the occupation. Civilians are victimizing the occupation. It's Kafka. This is a big shame. I don't know any precedent in history. Occupation was a victim for occupied people. We are entitled for dignity, for freedom. We are entitled for self-determination. All what we want, not less or more than what international law, international humanitarian law just give us. We want rule of law against this rule of jungle, this Israeli criminal army and the Israeli criminal leadership are doing. When we resorted to ICC, when we resorted to international law, when we resorted to Rome Statute, which, by the way, it's not a Palestinian invention, it's not Arab invention, it's the creme de la creme of humanity. Then we the human rights activists accused of being terrorists in suits, we are agents of terrorist organizations, we are doing lawfare, and we are misusing international law, international humanitarian, and the human rights, and we are classified as terrorists for US and for Israel. And ex-President Trump issued an executive order, fantastic executive order, saying if any provide evidence against Israel, against US, and making Israel or US citizens or leaders accountable for the war crime they are doing, they will be held accountable, and they can be sentenced up to 20 years and up to 400,000 USD on each account they are doing. Their properties can be confiscated and their accounts can be freezed and this and that. I want to say something. This level of pain and suffering, intolerable and unspeakable, it's too much when these war crimes are broadcasted at the real time to the whole world to see it, and the media, which is doing that, punished, including the American media, AP, New York Times, CBS, Al Jazeera, and the regional international media organizations, because even with these crimes, Israel wants to monopolize the story. There is one version, it's the Israeli version. Now,
Thank you, Raji. I want to cut you off so I can go to Amjad, if you don't mind. And I want to remind our viewers that that they can put questions in the chat. Amjad, we saw in the weeks before this conflict and during this attack and after an incredible amount of solidarity from Palestinians elsewhere outside of Gaza. We saw the events in Sheikh Jarrah and on Al-Aqsa starting this conflict. Can you tell us a little bit about what new forms of solidarity or power are emerging in this wider Palestinian response to the aggression on Gaza, and whether you see any opportunities or new challenges that are going to come about because of this new coordination or consciousness? And you're muted, Amjad, so unmute yourself, please.
Thank you again. And just to mention that now thousands of our beautiful youth that mentioned by Raji, this brilliant youth, women and children, now in the streets in Gaza, trying to clean the streets, and to collect some of the rebels. I think by these youth and children, we rely on them for the future. What's happened in the world, this wake up of the international solidarity, it's not only with the Palestinians, it's with justice, with the principles and the values of the human rights. It's not only with us, it's with the people themselves. And I hope that the Security Council could listen to these millions who get out in the US, in Europe, and everywhere, in each corner of the world, in order to get a resolution, to be on the side of the international law, of the UN resolutions itself, which was issued by the Security Council itself, to recognize the rights of the Palestinians, and which issued hundreds of resolutions and orders by the General Assembly. This happened whilst some leaders in the world closing their ears. They don't want to listen to the real victims on the ground, to the children, to our beautiful children that mentioned by our colleague Elizabeth, who want to go to the schools, to be protected. Once my daughter asked me a question, simple question. When we tried to evacuate our home, there was a bombardment nearby. Where to go on such bombardment? There is no safe place. Yes, I stayed at home. More than 100,000 people left their homes. Children, women, elders, people with disability, they left behind everything. Their simple medicine for diabetes and other medicine, they left it behind. The UNRWA people couldn't find a safe corridor to reach these schools, which are supposed to be protected. The ICRC, who's supposed to coordinate for the ambulance cars, couldn't. The issue now, it's between the hands of the people all over the world to act for justice and peace and the right of the Palestinians for self-determination. The causes, the real causes of this conflict, the ignorance and denial of the Israelis towards our legitimate rights. This is the basic thing that we are calling for. It's very simple.
Amjad, do you, in the activism that we saw unfolding inside Israel, in Jerusalem, in the West Bank at the same time as this bombardment of Gaza, do you see the glimmers of a renewed unified national movement by Palestinians who are going to sort of move beyond their ineffective leaders and take their own leadership of their cause? I mean, is this a new politics coming out, new power centers?
It's a new spirit. It's a real new spirit amongst the Palestinians. I can tell you now, we as Palestinians, we are united behind our national identity. In Jerusalem, West Bank, in diaspora, Gaza, 1948, we are now as Palestinians behind our rights to have our own state, with Jerusalem as a capital, the issue of refugees, the issue of our natural resources, which was confiscated by the Israelis, and the issue now, it's between the leaders, political leaders, in order to be online with this movement. And I think we are in a new stage in our Palestinian history.
Thank you. Elizabeth, I want to ask you a question about UNRWA's long-term viability and role. We've heard, I think in compelling terms, that Gaza remains both legally and practically occupied, notwithstanding Israel's claim to have withdrawn in 2005. And we know that UNRWA is essentially providing the services that a government would normally provide if a government were allowed to exist. And I've been asking this question ever since I became familiar with how UNRWA operates. Does it make any sense for UNRWA to continue delivering services that are Israel's obligation as the occupying power to deliver? And in these cycles that we see of destruction and human harm, in which UNRWA then ends up being the vehicle for a very reluctant and half-hearted international commitment to essentially prevent Gazans from starving, but not let them live the lives that they're entitled to under law, does UNRWA end up becoming the sort of fig leaf or enabler of an illegal occupation?
Okay, well, thanks for that question. I guess I would probably answer it maybe in brief in three ways. One, of course, is that, we don't operate because we decided to just do this work. We have a mandate from UN General Assembly, which was recently renewed in 2019 by the overwhelming majority of UN member states. So that is where we get our authority and our legal basis to operate. The second piece I would say is that, the question implies that the refugee issue is predominantly within Gaza and the West Bank. And of course, as you know so well, we have large refugee populations in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And those are places where there is no alternative for the Palestinians who are living there. So if we dwell just for one moment on Syria, for example, there's around 450,000 Palestinians residing there, many of whom were largely self-sufficient and highly integrated into Syrian society until the war broke out. They are now 100% dependent on UNRWA for humanitarian assistance and of course, education and healthcare. So, I mean, this notion that somehow disappearing would benefit or somehow help that population or resolve their statelessness or refugeehood, I just think is inaccurate and would basically just result in a stateless refugee population with no access to education, health, or humanitarian assistance. So I don't think we should. I think that when these kinds of questions are asked, we just have to remember the totality of the refugee population. And then the third piece I would say is that, what makes UNRWA extremely unique among UN humanitarian actors is what you refer to as its government-like services, and here in particular, its education and healthcare system. So throughout the 11 days of airstrikes in Gaza, for the most part, about halfway through or so, UNRWA was able to basically mobilize its education and emergencies program, which allowed students who were at home to learn, to have access to materials, and to be educated. So I don't really think that this is something that we would just want to walk away from because of some theoretical argument about who would be better placed to do it. The reality is, sadly, we have no alternative at this time to hand over any services to, whether it be a Palestinian state, neighboring state, another international organization. No one is there. And I think that, if you ask most Palestinians in Gaza or elsewhere, the most important thing that UNRWA does is education. And it's something that Palestinians cared very deeply about. It's an extremely highly educated population who in our system is helping to contribute to producing some of the most top students in the region and in the world. So I think we have to stay very grounded and very practical. This is a service that is worth protecting. And under no circumstances should we ever find ourselves in a situation where we think about, dismantling it with the idea that theoretically someone or somewhere else should do it. It's really critical, and it's one of the most important things I think that's happening in Gaza today. It is the lifeline for most Palestinians there.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And Tanya, I want to turn quickly to you to give, if you can, your read on how the Israeli consensus is might shift after what's happened over the last month. And we're in a context where annexation has become a mainstream idea, where there's very little political discourse that thinks about Palestinians as human beings and inside the government and the security establishment. So I'm wondering, do you see that getting worse, changing in any significant way as a result of the multiple, the multiple confrontations that we saw unfolding in Israeli cities and Jerusalem, and then with the attack on Gaza this past few weeks?
Yeah, so it's a big question. I know we're getting short on time, but I would just say that certainly, we're seeing a general shift to the right inside of Israel. I think that when it comes to the issue of Palestinians, of course, the Israeli public generally defers everything to the government, so they don't ask themselves a lot of questions, unfortunately. They assume too blindly that the government is taking care of their security, that its decisions are grounded in legitimate security decisions, which obviously it's, I think, very, very far from being the consideration. I think most of what's happening on the ground is clearly the result of political decisions and lack of political will to promote a resolution to the conflict, of course, to protect human rights, all of those things. I think in terms of how things will change, I do think that Israelis care about what people think around the world, and particularly in the United States. And that's why I'm glad this conversation is happening in the United States. I think that the protests that we've seen recently, certainly within Israel, in the West Bank and Jerusalem, as well as around the world, but again, particularly in the United States, I think will shift the way that people think, the way that young people think. And so I would encourage people to stay engaged. There's a ceasefire, as we said, it's very, very shaky, but even when there's a ceasefire, there's never really any quiet, not in Gaza, not in the West Bank, not in the region more broadly. And so people need to continue to pay attention. They need to continue to raise their voice. They need to continue to say that what's happening here is unacceptable. And I would hope the Israeli public would come along, but I don't think we need to wait for them. I think that governments around the world need to do the right thing and influence the Israeli government to do the right thing. And I think things will follow from there.
Thank you, Tanya. So we have an audience question, and I think we'll close with Raji and Amjad taking on this question, and then we'll wrap up. So the question is, how can American advocates and activists exert more pressure on the U.S. government to put an end to this situation and take a stronger stance? And by this, I assume the questioner means, what can U.S. advocates do to pressure the U.S. to help end the occupation and then the other crimes that you have discussed? So if each of you can take like 90 seconds or 2 minutes on this, and that will close us up. And maybe we'll start with you, Raji, and then end with Amjad. You're muted. You're still muted, Raji. There we go. Thank you.
I have the Robert F. Kennedy statue, behind me. I received it in 1991 as one of the most prestigious awards for human rights in the US. Biden had it 6 years ago. I feel shame that we both share this. He gave an oath as the president of the US that he will do everything for democracy, human rights, and freedom for people across the globe. I cannot understand how President of the United States and somebody believe in rule of law, democracy, and human rights can defend belligerent criminal occupation, how he can protect them from the ICC, and how he can support their criminal attack on 2.2 million civilians in Gaza. All what we want, we as a Palestinian, in simple words, end of this aggression, end of this occupation, end of this criminal, illegal, inhuman siege, end of our pain and suffering. And we are entitled for our right of self-determination, of independence, and having our Palestinian state in Gaza, West Bank, including East Jerusalem. We are human beings, we have dignity, and we are entitled for freedom, and it's called in English, self-determination. We will do our right of self-determination, independence, and we are strong enough, much more stronger, with the free, committed people across the globe to have an end for this criminal, belligerent occupation and this ongoing series of war crimes against the Palestinian civilians.
Okay.
All what we want, international law, international humanitarian law, and the human rights. Accountability for the criminals, this is the path and the way for justice and peace.
Thank you, Raji. And Amjad, give us 60 seconds. What is the main thing American advocates can do to help your cause?
We were very happy that Biden won after Trump. As we were happy now, we are very angry of his position during the war. He has to open his two eyes, not one eye. There is civilians in Gaza who need for defense, to be defended. And our legitimate rights, we will continue to struggle for it. According to the international law, to the UN resolutions, and the issue of accountability, it's part of our human rights. The last issue, homes which was destroyed in the last offensive and repaired and reconstructed, destroyed in this war. The issue is not reconstruction, the issue is not a humanitarian, the issue of ending this blockade, ending the blockade, and to impose human rights and accountability. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. We've been hearing today from Amjad Shawa, head of the Palestinian Non-Governmental Organizations Network, Raji Sourani, the director of the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, Elizabeth Campbell, who's the Washington director for UNRWA, and Tanya Hari, who is the executive director of Gisha. You've honored us all with your time and your insights. I'm Thanasi Kambanis from the Century Foundation, and I will turn it over for a last word from our host, Eric Schwartz, the president of Refugees International.
Thank you, Thanasis, and thanks to our panelists for these compelling and really heartrending presentations. I won't repeat what I said at the outset of this panel discussion, which reflects my own organization's views and our belief about advocacy priorities. Those comments, including those which refer to not using assistance to support violations of human rights and humanitarian law, speak for themselves. But I will say this in closing. Perhaps the fundamental principle that guides international humanitarianism and humanitarian actors is the principle of humanity. That principle of humanity stands for the proposition that human suffering, no matter where it occurs, should command the attention of humankind, that all individuals are inherently of equal worth. The suffering of a Palestinian child is no less compelling than similar suffering of a child anywhere in the United States, in Israel, anywhere. That principle guides humanitarians, as do principles of political neutrality and impartiality in the provision of assistance. But humanitarians also operate with a keen understanding that most humanitarian crises simply do not have humanitarian solutions. And as reflected in today's discussion, the principle of humanity won't be vindicated, won't be realized without concerted international efforts to address the broader issues of fundamental human rights for Palestinians and to confront the compelling questions and concerns which have been the focus of today's discussion. And that is a task for all of those, governments, international organizations, and non-governmental advocacy organizations committed to the principles of humanity and to justice. So I want to thank our panelists, and I want to thank all those who attended today's session. And these issues will continue to be of compelling concern to us and so many others. Thank you very much.